All right, Shabbos, say good morning. Good morning. Baruch Hashem, a great zichus to continue our week. Though it started a little bit difficult. Hashem, Tisha B'Av is a difficult day. Baruch Hashem, we're zochet Matzei Tisha B'Av to begin, to pick up, dust off, pick back up our Gemara, Meretz Hashem, Baruch Hashem, begin a new week together. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's shir, to thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor, Tilsa Mishpacha B'Eretz Yisrael, for dedicating all the shirim and drashos as a zuchus for Besoros Tovos for Am Yisrael. Our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Av, Haba Alina Latova, Steve and Wendy Drazen in honor of their parents, Israel Drazen, Dina Drazen, Eileen Rosenzweig, in the memory of Stanley Rosenzweig, Zichron Libracha. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshama Slav and Aliyah, the families in Nechama, all those who need a refuah, Shavan, Gedol, Kol Chol, the Yisrael, Kadosh Baruch Hu, Shlem Yeretz Hashem, bring home our hostages, B'Shalom and B'Karov, and allow our holy soldiers to be successful. B'Chol Ma'aseh Yedehem. But with that, let us begin. We have a really exciting daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Mem Zayin 47. Let's actually, we're picking up on Mem Vav on the base 46b, and let's just pick up at the beginning of the sugya Boy Rami Bar Chama 2, 4, 6, 8. So remember from the bottom. So again, if you remember yesterday's daf, we were speaking about the concept that what allows something to be transformed into Avoda Zara? So obviously, again, right, we need two things. Number one, a worshiper, right? Number two, a mode of worship. And number three, the object itself can't be something that is naturally forming and unchanged. So for example, the paradigmatic example of that was a mountain, right? So if an akum comes along, bows down to a mountain, the mountain does not become Avoda Zara, right? So why? Again, naturally occurring, unchanged through any human intervention. The interesting question that comes up, and that's what we've been dealing with now, is variations on that case. So stones get dislodged from a mountain. Again, naturally, does that go ahead and then the akum comes along and worships that? Does that create Avoda Zara? So along these same lines, we're trying to figure out when an akum goes ahead and worships something that is naturally occurring and then some type of change occurs, what's the status? Now, the other thing we saw, and this is incredibly important as well, when an akum goes ahead and worships something, so again, halacha l'maisa, assuming that the object conforms to these criteria, namely it's naturally forming and unchanged through human intervention, it does not become asa, which means it's totally permitted for my use, what we'll call mundane use. What we were introduced to in yesterday's daf was the notion, however, that it can become prohibited for consecrated use, what we call ligavoa. We explained that as saying that the more holy something is, the more sensitive it is to impurity. So therefore, for example, an akum comes along, worships my sheep. What's the status of my sheep? Status of my sheep? Mutter. In other words, if I want to go ahead and use it as a barbecue, right, I can go ahead, just waiting for chatzos today. You can tell them, right? So if I want to use it for a barbecue, I can use it for a barbecue. Absolutely no problem. What can't I do? I can't offer it up as a carbon. Okay? So now, based on that, so all that information, let's say an akum goes ahead and bows down to standing grain. Now remember again, standing grain by itself, right, naturally forming, unchanged, which means if an akum bows down to it, right, it shouldn't, for personal use, totally fine, but for sacrificial use, legavoa, it would be asr. Okay, so that's what we learned before. What's the knech, what's the wrinkle in this case? Now I'm taking that standing wheat and I'm changing it into flour. So I'm creating change with that object. So the Gemara says, Yesh shinui b'ne'evad, o ein shinui b'ne'evad. See, here's the shaila. Does the change in the object essentially take away the Avoda Zara element from it, right? Because now the truth is, even though it's quote unquote the same object, it's changed form. So does that change take away the Avoda Zara issue? Or does that change ultimately again still render the item in its original state, or is that change ineffective? Legabe Avoda Zara. Fascinating shayla. If you take a look at Rashi, let's just get a quick look at Rashi for just a moment. It's about 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 lines up from the bottom. Obviously, as we just mentioned before, the weed itself, of course, is totally permitted for my own use. For my own use. Now the truth is over here, it's also, remember, because standing wheat is mechuber, right? It's attached to the ground. So therefore, halach l'maisa, no change for me. And the question is, can we use it for carbonic or sacrificial purposes? So remember again, we've established that even if something is mechuber, if it's worshipped, ultimately you can't use it for gavoa. The shaila is, again, what do you do in this case? Kevan, the hadar nosnin, hadar tachin luhu, yesh shinui beneva, the lo mitzvah gavoa, ela be'enei, aval hecha dishtani shaper dami. So do we say that halacha l'maisa, the only time that mechuber is usher for gavoa, that something attached is prohibited for sacrificial or temple use, is when it's unchanged. But if it's changed, ultimately again, it should be mutter. Rashi says, or in shinui beneva, va'aser, the lo mahani le shinui. Now I just want to point out how tremendous this is. Understand, all kidding aside, right? But after Tisha B'Av is over, actually the Sfarim bring down that already again, Tisha B'Av Chodesh Av is already the beginning of Yomim Noraim. And how incredible is it that on Matzei Tisha B'Av, as really again, we begin to put ourselves in the mindset, ultimately again, of Elul, of Yomim Noraim, that what does the daf give us? A Gemara about change. A Gemara about change. And I will say, by the way, you know what the real question in all this is? How much change is real change? That's really the shayla of the Gemara. How much change really has to be affected in order for an entity to become something fundamentally different? And I will say, is this not the very question with which we struggle with our entire lives? I know that I have to change. I know there are things about myself that I have to change, things about my life that I have to change. But how much change do I really have to make in order to become the best version of me? So the Gemara is framing it in terms of standing wheat, but the real shaila ultimately is in terms of ourselves as well. Incredible, incredible. So let's go weiter. Armar Zutra, Braid Rav Nachman, Tashmas, let's analyze. Listen to this. Anything that is usher for the mizbeach. So we'll say, for example, let's see. This is talking about now, like, for example, animals. So let's say again, what's an example of an animal usher for the mizbeach? Ruvain worships my sheep. He worships my sheep. Or the sheep, we'll see, for example, was sodomized, right? I'm not coming up with that example on my own. That's the Gemara's example, as we'll see in just a moment. Right? So the animal becomes disqualified. So the Gemara says, what's that halacha? Vladosea and mutarin. Interestingly enough, if that prohibited animal has offspring, the offspring is permitted. So the Gemara says, V'tani Allah, Rabbi Eliezer Oser, and ultimately again Rabbi Eliezer says that it's Oser. V'lav itmar Allah. So also the Gemara says, and we said about this, Amra Nachman, Amra Baravua. Machlokes, we'll say, let's analyze. What's the case here exactly? What's the case? Machlokes, kishenir ba'u ulabasof ivru. So we'll say that's how the Gemara is using this example where the animal was sodomized. So a sodomized animal is also for a carbon. So now the Gemara seems to be saying is, even though the mother is also for carbonic purposes, the offspring is mutter. So the Gemara says, okay, well, what's the case? Rabbi says like this. The machlokes is, kishenir ba'u ulabasof ibru. If the animal was first sodomized and then became pregnant. That's the machlokes case ultimately again between Rabbi Eliezer and ultimately the Tana Kama. Rashi says over here, actually let's go. Fine. Top of Mem Zayin. Aval, Ibru, Ulbasof Nirvu. But let's say the animal was first pregnant. And then what happened? Then the animal was sodomized. Everyone agrees, Divrei Akol, Asurin. Everyone agrees in that case, ultimately what? Both the mother and the offspring are also for carbonic purposes. The Gemara says, now interesting, so what does that show you? Now, why don't you say like this? At the end of the day, why should the offspring be usher? After all, when the mother births the offspring is changed. What do you see from here? That when something is already in existence, just because you change the form doesn't represent a change. So therefore, the Gemara is applying this to the weak case. In other words, the pregnant mother being sodomized is the equivalent of the Avoda Zara wheat being ground into flour. In both cases, there's nothing new here, right? In both cases, what happens? The object changes form. So the wheat is changed into flour. The pregnant mother is then turned into a mother and its offspring. But at the end of the day, nothing really fundamentally changes. So what do you see from here? In the same way that if the mother is pregnant and then sodomized, ultimately the offspring is usher, so too the Gemara wants to suggest that when the Avoda Zara wheat, I'm calling it Avoda Zara wheat, but you understand it's not really like a good statement. It's standing wheat that was worshipped by an akum for Avoda Zara. Therefore, the wheat itself cannot be used for gavoa. And now what we're suggesting is the flour should not be usable also. The Gemara says, Hakanami, our case over here of the standing wheat turned into flour, ki ibru ulabasof nir v'udami. Should be exactly like this case, where the mother was first pregnant, the baby was there already, then ultimately again it was sodomized, so therefore it should be aser. Incredible. So that's the Gemara's suggestion over here. The Gemara says, an alternate version of this. So the Gemara says, fine, alternate version of this. Machlokes kishenirvu lebasof ivru. No. The machlokes case is when the mother first, right, she was nirvu and then became pregnant. Aval ibru ulebasof nivru, but mother was first pregnant and then ultimately again is sodomized. Divrei hakol aser. Everyone agrees in that case, ultimately again, that the offspring will be aser. And therefore, Bahani Nami, Ki Ibru Ulabasov Nirvudami, and our case, ultimately again, of the standing wheat being turned into flour, is comparable to this case as well, where the mother is pregnant first and then sodomized. And just like in that case, the offspring is aser, so too in our case, the standing wheat being turned into flour will also remain aser. All right, so both sides, where the Gemara is holding right now is wants to suggest the following, that it could very well be that we accept the principle of yesh shinui b'nei avad, right? We're both saying, what's the fundamental question of the Gemara? The Gemara is asking if the akum worships something, thereby rendering that object unfit. Zaki, does your mother know you're drinking soda before 6 o'clock in the morning? All right, so okay, what's that happens in Daf stays in Daf, right? Oh no, she listens to the podcast. Oh, sorry. All right, sorry. All right, okay. Sorry. I owe you. I was like, so the Gemara says as follows. So the fundamental shaila is like this. The fundamental shaila is like this. When an akum worships something and that object is transformed, so our fundamental shaila is, does transformation remove the Avoda Zara identity from that initial object? So I want to point out something very interesting. Even if the answer to that is yes, let's assume for a moment the answer to that is yes, the follow-up shaila then becomes what? How much change is necessary in order for the new item to be unrelated to the previous item? So that's the follow-up shaila. Because also what the Gemara is saying is like this, it's quite possible that taking standing wheat and transforming it into flour, although it's a change, it's not enough of a change. Why? Because it's really the same thing. It's really the same thing, just different form. Much like the pregnant mother that gives birth ultimately to the child. The baby it's the same baby. It's the same baby, just ultimately again in different forms. So I just want to point out, the Gemara is clearing the shaila about yesh, what's the lashon? Yesh shinui b'nei avad. Can you change something that has been worshipped and thereby transform it into something else? Again, even if the answer to that question is yes, and remove the initial Avoda Zara identity, how much change is necessary to affect change? Okay, so Gemara says, let's analyze this. Gemara therefore wants to suggest that the case of the wheat being transformed into flour is effectively the same case as the pregnant animal that is sodomized, and therefore again, just as the offspring is usher in that case, because no real change has occurred to the offspring, so to the flour will be offspring. So to the flour will be us. Which Gemara says, well, 1 second. Perhaps the cases are not really comparable. In the pregnant mother case, it's not really fair, right? Because initially, remember again, the fetus was an animal, and now it's an animal. In other words, that literally even just alt's form, it hasn't changed. Right? In other words, the same, let's say, fully mature fetus in utero is the same animal once it's birthed. It's literally the same thing. Nothing's changed except its location. The Gemara says, Dashahu da'achiza ba'anpa. There was just a door that was close to it. In other words, it's referring to the womb of the animal, right? So the animal is in its mother, so the door, so to speak, is closed. The animal is birthed, the door is open, but it's the same exact animal. To which the Gemara says, "Haha me karachiti v'hashtikimcha." It's not really, in other words, I will say, it's not fair to compare the case of a pregnant mother to wheat turned into flour. I understand why you think you could compare them. In both cases, one item is, so to speak, birthing a new item, but in one case, one item is birthing something, and the birthed item is the same thing as the pre-birthed item, and in one case, again, the birthed item is fundamentally different than the initial item. Okay, so we'll say, the Gemara doesn't answer it. The Gemara doesn't answer it. So we'll say, how do we paskin? And this is very important. The Rambam paskins, yesh shinui b'nei avad. That's how the Rambam paskins. That ultimately, again, if something is worshipped, and ultimately, again, the form is changed, ultimately, the new item does not have the restrictions legavoa, and therefore the Rambam paskins in this case that if the akum worshipped standing wheat, so as much as you cannot use that standing grain for gavoa, if you take that grain and you transform it ultimately into flour, the flour can be used for menachos. That's how we paskin, which seems to indicate that we hold yesh shinui b'nei avad. So again, you could change something that's been worshipped and render it into a new state, and even if you just change the actual state of it without introducing anything new, ultimately, again, the change is effective. So I will say that's hashkafa l'maisa also. We see from here, and this is very important, seidel derech as we go forward, that sometimes change does not have to be dramatic. And change doesn't even have to be fully comprehensive. And change doesn't require me necessarily to even introduce brand new things into my life. But sometimes the way change starts is taking all of the ingredients that you have in your life right in front of you and maybe just reorganizing those very same ingredients into a little bit of a different concoction, to a little bit of a different model. And sometimes even just doing that is enough to put me on a new derech for life. Incredible. Bayrish Lakish. What's another great case over here? Lulavu ma'al mitzvah. Wow, this is fascinating. I will say, we're mamish getting into Yamim Noraim over here. I just want to point out, it's fascinating. So we go with change, right? That's Elul, Rosh Hashanah, Aseret Simei Tshuva, Yom Kippur. Next, Sukkot. You cannot make this stuff up. Right? I mean, I guess you can, but it is absolutely amazing. It's all right here. You just have to want to see it. So, so what's an interesting case over here, right? Akum bows down to a palm tree. Now again, I will say, so palm tree, so remember again, mechuber. So if an akum bows down to a palm tree, mechuber, what's the impact it has on the palm tree? What's the impact? So remember, lehedyot, nothing, legavoa, cannot be used. Cannot be used, right? So now, but here's the interesting question in this. All right, I'm not using it for gavoa, I'm not using it for the Beis HaMikdash, I'm using it for my mitzvah. So can I take a palm branch and ultimately use that for lulav and esrog? So mishtach ve'ledeka, mahu mitzvah. Ultimately, again, can we ultimately use it for mitzvah? So Rashi says over here, ashera. Sorry, lulav ha'ma'al mitzvah. Sorry, imtin salama yesh ne'evad b'mechubar. It's a gavoa hachal inyan mitzvahs lulav mai. So we'll say, see here, we're now up until now we kind of thought there were just two categories. There was hedyot and there was gavoa. So again, an akum goes ahead and bows down to something mechubar for hedyot purposes, totally mutter. For gavoa, aser. Now, follow-up question. What about the mitzvahs? Akum bows down to something mechubar, bows down to the palm tree. Can I use a branch for this for a mitzvah for lulav? So the Gemara says, let's analyze this. Ki ilan, mal mitzvahs. Ki ilan shenatu mitchil lekach. Sorry. Bi ilan shenatu mitchil lekach. Lo tibay lecha. Now, obviously, if the tree was initially planted for Avoda Zara purposes, right, from the beginning, then obviously that's a non-starter because that's aser for everything, right? If something, also remember again, the only time that something mechubar doesn't become Avoda Zara is when it was initially planted or created for non-Avoda Zara purposes. But if a tree from the beginning, this palm tree from the beginning was planted for Avoda Zara, then it's also for everything, even hedyot, certainly for a mitzvah. Kiti by the chas, what's the shaila? Li'ilan shenatu ulubasov avdu. Okay, so we'll say, and this goes back to Shabbos' daf. What's the shaila case? The shaila case is the tree was initially planted just to be a tree. Just to be a tree. Then afterwards it was worshipped. It was worshipped. So now the shaila is, So Gemara says, I'm sorry. And then it was worshipped. So can you use a palm branch from it for Avoda Zara? That according to Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, it's not even a shayla. Why? Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda is of the opinion, we saw this in Shabbos' daf, is of the opinion that halacha l'maisa, something that was originally planted for hedyot, right, mundane purposes, and then was subsequently worshipped, ultimately again becomes Avoda Zara, bona fide Avoda Zara. So where is the shayla? Aliba d'Rabbanan. Okay, according to the Rabbanan, ultimately, again, what's the shayla? So what is the status for the mitzvah? So again, just sort of framing the case. Palm tree is planted for mundane purposes, regular palm tree purposes. Then what? Akum worshipped it. Fine. So I know hedyot it's mutter, gavoa is aser, and our shayla is for the mitzvah, can it be used? So we'll say, listen to this. What's the shayla? Mi mo'is klape gavoa, Olo. So this is an interesting formulation. Do we see something like this as just repulsive, disgusting? In other words, we'll say, do we just say, look, this is not the kind of stuff you use for a mitzvah. Something that was worshipped for idolatrous purposes, you can't go ahead and use it for a mitzvah. Right? So that's really the shayla. So Mara says, although, Kiyas Rabdimi Amar, Ba'ashera, Shebitla, Kami Boile. Oh, so we'll say, listen to this. So Rav Dimi comes along and says, I want to reframe this question for you. Here's how this would work. What happens if there was an Asherah tree that was battled, right? That was battled. That was negated, right? That ultimately again that the akum was mevatel. That the akum was mevatel. So again, remember again, an akum has the ability to be mevatel avodah zara, right? How? Again, if he defaces it in some way, damages it in some way. So what happens? Fascinating. So now you have decommissioned Asherah. Decommissioned Asherah. So could decommissioned Asherah, can you use a palm branch for that? For lulav. Look at Asherah just a moment. Asherah, shenes afla hedyon. Now, now remember again, what's interesting about this case? An Asherah tree, now remember again, an Asherah tree is a tree that was planted mitrila for Avodah Zara. When it's planted mitrila for Avodah Zara, what does that mean? Even lahedyot, even for mundane purposes, automatically us. So Rashi says, ubitla, kedemi masti, it's a nota mashichlif, the kami boile im ru'uya shuv lemitzvah imlav. So here's the real shayla. There was an Asherah. Akum came along and was mevatel it. So now we'll say, what's the shayla? Can I take a palm branch from that for sukkis, for lulav? So what's the shayla? Watch this. Yesh dichui eitzel mitzvahs, or ein dichui eitzel mitzvahs. Ooh, okay, so we'll say, we've seen this many times before in our journey through Shas. Do we say that once something is set aside for non-use for a mitzvah, categorically that status cannot change? So once something can't be used for a mitzvah, it is forever unusable for a mitzvah. So for example, in this case over here, the Asherah was obviously off limits to anything. Once an Asherah, always an Asherah, at least for mitzvah purposes, maybe not for hedyot. In other words, if I want to go ahead and now use that Asherah wood to fuel my fire, that might be permitted. But halacha l'maisa, perhaps dichoy eitzel mitzvahs, once something is set aside for non-use for a mitzvah, it remains set aside for non-use forever. That's the shayla. Look at Rashi. Yesh dichoy eitzel mitzvahs. Mi havi shaycha Torah's dichoy b'mitzvahs. Dinema hoil b'nitcha ba'odu Asherah yitchol lamis. Do we say once something is set aside for non-use, it remains forever set aside for non-use, or not? Or not? That's the shayla. That's the shayla. So the Gemara says, Tifshot le midisnan. So I'll say, let's analyze this. We have another Mishnah. This is really interesting. Kiso v'niskala pata v'nelchas. So we'll say there's a mitzvah of kisu hadam. Kisu hadam means that after you shecht either foul or non-domesticated animals, the halach is you have to cover the blood. You have to cover the blood. So here's an interesting halach. Here's an interesting case. Kiso. Let's say again, I shechted a deer, for example, and what happens? I covered it. I covered the blood. V'niskala, and then it was uncovered. The wind blew the dirt off the blood. What's the halacha? Patra melachasas. I don't have to cover it again. In other words, once I've covered it once, even if it becomes uncovered, ultimately I do not have an obligation to go ahead and cover it again. Now watch this. Kisoa haruach. What happens if I shechted the animal, the blood is there, I didn't do anything yet, the wind blew dirt onto the blood. So now the blood is covered, but ultimately, again, I didn't do it. Chayiv l'chasos. I'm obligated to put dirt over the blood. Because again, I have to do the mitzvah of kisui. It's not enough for blood to be covered. I have to cover the blood. Listen to this. Lo shanu ela shechazav v'niskala. When we say that if the wind blew dirt on the blood, I have an obligation to cover the blood. That's only when the wind subsequently blew the dirt off the blood. So now the blood is subsequently uncovered. Then I have an obligation to recover it. But at the end of the day, if the blood did not become subsequently uncovered, I do not have an obligation to recover it. Right? The Gemara says, why? I don't understand. Even when the wind blew, covered the blood, and then the wind blew again, and subsequently uncovered it, why should I have an obligation to cover the blood? We should say that what? Once ultimately, again, the mitzvah was set aside. In other words, once the wind covers the blood of Osai, then what? I could say, look, the mitzvah was done, right? Nitcha. In other words, it has been. Yeah, it's not even set aside. It's been set aside. Like nitcha literally means like set aside. In other words, it's been set aside. It's been set aside. You know, I can't do it because it's already. Why don't we say that once the mitzvah has been set aside, ultimately it remains set aside? Papa says, what do you see from here? Papa says, what do you see from here? You see You see that although there could be a situation where you are episodically precluded from performing a mitzvah, once that factor that's precluding your mitzvah performance is removed, you once again become obligated. So again, for example, I shechted the deer. There's blood. I have to cover it. The wind blows. It covers the blood. When the blood is covered already, so again, the mitzvah of kisui is nidche. It is set aside because it's kind of been de facto performed. If the wind blows again, uncovers the blood, now I have an obligation. What do you see from here? That mitzvahs are never perpetually set aside for non-performance. That even if there's something currently blocking me from performing the mitzvah right now, as soon as the blockage is removed, I once again become obligated. Now, by the way, so why is it important for us? Let's go back. What's our problem? Our question is, there was an Asherah tree. The Akum came along, was Mavatal, the Asherah tree. Can I take a palm branch from the Asherah tree and go ahead and use it? And now again, so the Gemara says, what does that depend on? Once upon a time when it was an Asherah, it was set aside for non-use for a mitzvah. Now it's no longer an Asherah. Do we say, since it was an Asherah, therefore forever precluded from its use or not? It would seem to be based on this. Ein dichui eitzel mitzvahs. There is no permanent blockage to being used as a mitzvah, and therefore it would appear that once the Asherah was negated, once it was decommissioned, I should be able to use a palm branch from it for lulav. So Gemara says, Rav Papa gufei iboyle. No, Gemara says, you're quoting Rav Papa as a statement of fact. It's important to understand that Rav Papa's very statement is the source of our question. So Gemara says, Mifshat pshita Rav Papa dein dichoy eitzel mitzvahs. So Rav Papa accepts this premise. Ein dichoy eitzel mitzvahs. A mitzvah is never permanently set aside for non-performance. Even if there's a blockage preventing me from performing it right now, if the blockage is removed, the mitzvah once again is in play. So Rav Papa subscribed to that concept. The Gemara says, Rav Papa dein dichoy eitzel mitzvahs, lo shna l'kula, lo shna l'chumra. So do we say that that's true whether it's l'kula or l'chumra? In other words, Rav Papa holds that in all circumstances. O Dilma, sapuki misapkele. Or maybe Rav Papa was just unsure. O l'chumra aminan, l'kula lo aminan. Maybe Rav Papa was unsure, I will say. So Rav Papa said, Rav Papa paskin im dichei eitzel mitzvahs l'chumra, but not l'kula. So therefore, for example, in the case of kisei hadam, Rav Papa would say like this: I checked the animal, the blood is there, the wind came, it blew the dirt on the blood. Everyone agrees that when the blood is covered, I have no mitzvah, right? Now the blood was uncovered, right? The wind blew again, it blew off the dirt. So Shaila is now, do we say dichui eitzel mitzvahs ulo? Do we say since the blood was set once upon a time set aside for non-performance of kisei because it was covered, therefore it is never again subject to the mitzvah of kisei hadam or not? So Rav Papa will say l'chumra, for stringency purposes, we'll say ein dichui eitzel mitzvahs, and therefore we'll tell you cover the blood again. But maybe by lulav, by the Asherah, maybe he'll say you can't use it. Maybe he only says ein dichoy eitzel mitzvahs when that yields a stringent conclusion, but not when it yields leniency, because allowing you to use the lulav from an Asherah tree ultimately, again, would be a leniency. So that's the shaila. Rav Papa says it, but does he apply it in all cases? To which the Gemara says, tegu. Ultimately, again, the Gemara does not answer that particular question. So we'll say, so again, this concept of yesh dichoy eitzel mitzvahs, ein dichoy eitzel mitzvahs, ultimately, again, is an ongoing question, right? It's a machlokes throughout Shas. I have to look up how the Rama paskins in this case, or whether or not there is one psak in general, or whether it's case specific. But halacha l'maisa, again, we see again this question of lulav from an Asherah tree, a decommissioned Asherah tree, is going to be fundamentally dependent. And even if you subscribe to that concept in all cases, or just l'chumra, the Gemara ends off, teku. Okay, next. So interesting. So watch this. So Akum bows down, right? He worships an animal. So we'll say now we can go through our categories, right? Akum bows down to a sheep, right? What's the halacha? Let's go through the categories. Lehedyot, if I want to go ahead and consume that sheep, what's the halacha? Mutter. Legavo, I want to use it as a karban, aser. Now again, lemitzvah. So ultimately, again, I will say, so that's going to be that's our machlokes that we saw before. And now the Gemara asks a follow-up question: can I use the wool of that sheep ultimately for tchelas? For tchelas, so the Gemara says. So the Gemara says, mal tchelas. So we'll say. So the Gemara says. I just want to. I meant to mention this on the previous sugya. Just the Gemara ends off by a take of yesh dichoy eitzel mitzvahs. Right, so is there dichui, is there not dichui? So halacha l'maisa, the Gemara ends off with a teku. It's important to understand that hashkafa l'maisa, it is clear. There's no such thing as yesh dichui eitzel mitzvahs by a yid. Even if at times I am down and out, and at times I am nidchef from mitzvahs. And we have moments like this in life, where I just feel cut off from ruchnius, and I just feel cut off from myself, and I just feel cut off from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's important to understand that even though I go through periods of disconnection, we don't say once disconnected, always disconnected. A yid always has the ability to go ahead and bounce back and rebound and become a Baal Tshuva and get things back on the rails. There's no such thing as yesh dichoy eitzel mitzvahs by a Jew. Halacha l'maisa, it's a teku. But hashkafa l'maisa, we paskin ein dichoy eitzel mitzvahs. A yid is never fully set aside, is never precluded, is never down and out from his relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Okay, so now the Gemara says as follows: can you take the wool of a behema and that was worshipped and use it for tcheles? So the Gemara says, okay, what are you talking about? Dimai. What kind of tcheles are we referring to over here? So the Gemara says, dimai. Eat tcheles lekohanim. So again, if you're talking about tcheles for the big day kahuna, we'll say, how incredible is this? We've got a Teiko Ilya Navi. We've got ultimately again Lulav and Esrog. We've got Tshuva, and now Baruch Hashem, we've got Beis Hamikdash and Big Day Kahuna. All on Yud Ba'av. Even though you're right, the Beis Hamikdash was still burning on this day. But even in the midst of the flames, look how much beautiful and holy optimism that Ribono Shel Olam is throwing our way. It's incredible. So what about Tcheles for the big day kahuna? So the Gemara says, can you use that? So the Gemara says, okay, so that's what we learned before. Hainu B'ay Rami Bar Chamas. That was Rami Bar Chama's question before. We already dealt with this. Eat Tcheles L'tzitzis. And if you're talking about Tcheles for tzitzis, Hainu B'ay Reish Lakish. Okay, so that's what Reish Lakish was asking before. About mitzvahs. To which the Gemara says, you're right. You're right. You didn't really have to ask this question, because the truth is, this question is not all that different than the questions we were asking before about Lulav and Esrog, and so on and so forth. So why did you have to bring this up? So the Gemara says, because ultimately, again, there is another follow-up question which we do need to ask. What was the follow-up shaila? Not as much about whether or not you can use the wool for tcheles, but karne ma'lechatzotzros. Interesting. Can you use the horn of the animal ultimately for trumpets, for chatzotzros? Right? So, or shokea mahu lechalilin, or ultimately again the thigh, or better stated, the thigh bones. Interesting. I don't know if it's still done. but they used to make flutes, a flute out of the thigh bone of the animal. So can you use the flute, right? Can you use the thigh bone for the flute? So we'll say, b'nei me'eha malhu lepe'aros. Can you use sinews from the animal, ultimately again for harp strings? So again, what's happening over here? So the Gemara is asking, and this is really fascinating, can you use parts of the animal for the instruments of the Beis HaMikdash? Isn't that fascinating? So again, because it can't be asking about tcheles for Big Day Kahuna, because tcheles for Big Day Kahuna, that's use of something that was worshipped for a mitzvah. The Gemara is asking a more nuanced question. Can you use parts of the animal to create, again, animal worshipped by an akum? Can you go ahead and use parts of the animal ultimately, again, to create the instruments for the Beis HaMikdash? We'll say, such a beautiful, beautiful Gemara. So now we'll say, what does it depend on? And this is incredible. So we'll say, so now let me just give this outside for just a moment. There is a fundamental machlokes. Rashi points out over here in Maseches Sukkah. Machlokes is, we know that there was shira, there was song in the Beis HaMikdash. Was the mandated shira, the peh, had to be sung by the Leviim, right with their mouth, and the instruments were just there to beautify the verbal singing? Or no, Iker Shira Bakli. No, the music in the Beis HaMikdash has to be done with instruments. So is the Iker music in the Beis HaMikdash by mouth, right? Or ultimately, again, is it with instruments? So the Gemara says, watch this. So if you hold that the Iker music in the Beis HaMikdash, Shabbos say, just how many beautiful Beis HaMikdash Gemaras are there? And one day, Abbas, you understand, one day we're going to hear this music again. One day, Emiras Hashem Bekarov, this music is going to be interesting. It's going to be an interesting adjustment, right? Because we'll say music was such an integral part in the Beis HaMikdash. You cannot have Avoda without Shira. The Rambam Paskins, if they performed the Avoda without the Shira of the Leviim, the Avoda was unfit. Ultimately, again, song and music plays such a central role in Beis HaMikdash service. So according to the opinion that says Iker Shira B'Kli, the primary music was done with utensil, with instruments, then certainly again, you can't make instruments out of the pieces of this animal which was worshipped by Avoda Zara. That's clear. So Kiti Ba'Lecha, what's the Shaila? Iker Shira B'Peh. Ultimately, again, the one who says that no, primary Shira was by mouth. The Gemara says, Basume Kala Ba'almahu. Really, instruments were just there to what? To amplify the verbal singing. But the instruments themselves are not the ikar. So then the shaila is umaisina. So since we say that the ikar shira is bepeh, and therefore the instruments are only there just really as an accompaniment. So perhaps you should be able to make the instruments out of the pieces of this animal that was worshipped by Avoda Zara. Or maybe no. Maybe even so, you still can't use the pieces of this animal worshipped by Avoda Zara for anything in the Beis HaMikdash. The Gemara says, Teku. The Gemara ultimately leaves this as a Teku. And I'll point out over here, just so you should know, the way the Rambam Paskins is, the Rambam Paskins, Iker Shira Bepeh, that the primary shira in the Beis HaMikdash was by mouth, and ultimately, again, the instruments were just there as an accompaniment. Now, that may or may not have bearing on this issue, because the Gemara ends off as a teiku, but just interesting to note, can you make the instruments ultimately out of the pieces of this animal that was worshipped for Avoda Zara? That the Gemara leaves unresolved. Incredible. Boy Rabbi's found Shiloh. Interesting case. Akum bows down to a spring. He bows down to a spring of water. Can you use the water ultimately again for nesach and for libations? So what's the case? So maybe the shayla is like this. What is the akum bowing down to? What is he worshiping? Is he worshiping his reflection, or is he worshiping the water? If it's his reflection, then maybe Allah lamaisa the water is mutter. If it's the water, then maybe the water is also. To which the Gemara says, Viti boile, safal. So if that's the case, then why are you asking about a spring? Just ask about a regular bucket of water. Let's say an akum goes in and bows down to a bucket of water. Is the water usable for nesachim? Same shaila. Is he worshiping his reflection, or is he worshiping the water? So Rishon says, no. This is the shaila. This is why I asked by spring. When the akum bows down to the spring, we assume he's worshiping the water, not his reflection. So the shaila is, which water is he worshiping? Is he just worshiping the water that's in front of him right now at the time, let's say, he prostrates himself? And therefore, again, that water is gone, right? We assume that water moved on. And therefore, the other water should be permitted for libational purposes. Odilma lidabrona demaya kasogid. Or maybe, interestingly enough, Rashi says lidabrona linar likiluach shalnar. Maybe he's actually worshiping the movement or the current of the river, or the spring. If that's the case, ultimately, again, if it's the current or the movement, then that pretty much renders all of the water unfit. So Gemara says, "Umi misirab." I don't understand. Would this be usher anyway? One second. An akum can't prohibit something that belongs to the public. In other words, we're assuming over here that a spring belongs to the general populace. So we'll say, can you imagine if an akum had the ability to answer something through, right, that wasn't his, that belonged to the public through worship? That would be a disaster. So why is the akum even going ahead and answering anything? The Gemara says, no. Gemara says, Lo tzricha de kanevai me'ara. Or me'ar it's changed when Hagos it's Yudim. No, it's his spring. It's his spring. It's not the public spring, it's his spring. So the Shaila is now it's his spring. He worshipped it. Ultimately, again, is that water permitted for libational purposes? Gemara says it depends. Is he worshiping ultimately again? What is it? Is he worshiping the current? Or ultimately, again, is he worshiping just the water in front of him? So the Gemara doesn't seem to answer that. The Gemara doesn't say Tegu, but the Gemara seems to leave that unresolved as well. Incredible. Mishnah. Mishaya based on Samach Lavos Chavim. We'll say interesting case over here. So let's say again, I have a house. And I have if you can imagine, the best way to imagine this, imagine a semi-detached home, right? So what happens? I share a wall with the next door neighbor, and it happens to be my next door neighbor found Avoda Zara and created a shtibel, an Avoda Zara shtibel, right? In his, he doesn't like the main shtibel, he doesn't like the main place of Avoda Zara, they sing too much, whatever it is. So therefore, again, he wants a faster davening, he needs a slower, whatever it is, right? He wants to get home, right? So the Maisa, he started his own Avoda Zara shtibel next door. So okay, so now again, now remember, it didn't start this way, right? This happened after the fact. So he moved in afterwards, and now again, we're next door neighbors, we share a common wall. So what happens? Now the wall falls down. So what's the halacha? Asur livnoso. I can't rebuild that wall. Why can't I rebuild that wall? Because if I rebuild it, then I'm ultimately again rebuilding it for Avoda Zara also. Because if I rebuild it, I'm going to use it, and he's going to use it, and now he's got Avoda Zara operating over there. To which the Gemara says, so what should he do? He said, Yasa. What should he do? So no problem. What do? You withdraw. In other words, I give up a little bit of property, as we're going to see, but I pull back into my property Dalet Amos, and that way, again, by pulling back into my property Dalet Amos, what do? It's no longer a shared wall. I'm building on my property exclusively. It's my wall exclusively. And therefore, I'm not benefiting Avoda Zara. Okay? So Gemara says, V'shalo avodas kochavim. And I will say, now this is an interesting case. Now, all of this, by the way, in this case over here, that's because it's my wall, right? In other words, it started as my wall, and then ultimately my neighbor moved in afterwards. He said, hey, do you mind if I build up against your wall? I said, sure, it doesn't matter to me. It's not a big deal. And then something became Avoda Zara. What about if the middle wall is actually a shared wall? It's actually a shared wall. That's shalo, v'shal avodas kochavim. So for example, I will say, Rashi points out, let's say, for example, let's assume for a moment it's a 2 amma thick wall. Right, the wall is 2 amas thick, and let's say again, literally 1 amma thickness is mine, 1 amma thickness is the akum's. So we'll say, so in that case, remember again, it's jointly owned. What's the halacha? Amud beis will say, nidon mechza al mechza. So ultimately, again, so we'll say, so in that case over here, still the same halacha. When I build, I have to build in my own. But we'll say, here's what's interesting. See, normally when we speak about withdrawing 4 amas, right? In a regular case, what's the 4 amas? It says, say, that in case somewhere where the wall is mine, it's 2 amas of the thickness of the wall, and then two more amas. In case number 2, where it's a shared wall, I can't count the akum's amma of thickness as part of my 4. I can count my 1, so I have 1 amma of thickness of the wall, and then 3 more into my property. So the Gemara says, Avanov ve'etza ve'afro mitamin atmein kesheretz. So we'll say, interestingly enough, in this case, and this is the shared wall case. The shared wall case, the debris of the wall itself, right? Literally the stones, the wood, the dirt, the mortar, ultimately again has quasi avodah zara status, and therefore again is tameh like tumas sheretz. Incredible. Rashi points out that Abonav Eitzav Afarav Shel Osa Kosel Mitamen Kisharetz Vafilu Chelko Lefi She'ein Breira. It was saying to yourself, 1 second, that's not fair, right? One arm of that wall is mine, one arm is the Oved Kochavim's. So ultimately, again, yet all of it is Tameh Tumas Sheretz like Avodah Zara, because as Rashi says, let's Breira. There's no way of knowing in the debris which is mine, which is the akum's, and therefore all of the debris has tumas sheretz. Incredible. So when it says Shnemar Shaketz Teshaktzen, Rabbi Kiva says Kinida. No, it actually ultimately has tumas nida. Why tumas nida? Shneemar Tizarim Kimodava Say Tomar Lo. So we'll say so. The Navi compares Avodah Zara to a nida. We'll discuss that comparison. Right? Manida metame b'masa. Just as a nida ultimately again can transmit tuma through masa, through carrying, ultimately again so to have avodah zara can transmit tuma through carrying. I think we're supposed to analyze. But 1 second. So that's case number one. Case number one, the wall is mine. So what's the halacha? The wall falls down, and what does the Mishnah say? I have to pull back into my property 4 amas. But 1 second, if I'm pulling back into my property 4 amas, so we'll say who's going to take that? Who's going to take that new open space? The akum, as suddenly again he's going to extend his shtibel, right? He's going to extend his avodah zara, his avodah zara place of worship. So at the end of the day, by me withdrawing, I understand that I'm not giving him the benefit of my newly built wall, but I am giving him the benefit of additional space. No. You don't leave the area vacant, you make it into a bathroom, right? You make it into an outhouse. So the Gemara says, 1 second, 1 second, you can't make a bathroom right there. A bathroom requires tznius, a bathroom requires modesty. And again, you're going to just leave this open space for use as a bathroom. You can't do that. The Avale Beis Akisi the Laila. Now we'll say it's a nighttime bathroom. So you've seen the distinction before that there were daytime bathrooms and nighttime bathrooms. Nighttime bathrooms require a lot less privacy, right? Because it's dark outside. So therefore you wouldn't use it by day. Ultimately you'll only use it by night. The Gemara says still, Ezut Sanua. Who is someone who is truly modest? The Gemara says, this is a person who goes to the bathroom in the same place at night as he does by day. Now the Gemara says, so ultimately, you know, now the Gemara qualifies that statement to mean, it doesn't literally mean location, it means manner. In the same way that a person is supposed to be modest when they go to the bathroom. And modesty in halacha is defined by like how much of your body you uncover when you relieve yourself. That same modicum, that same level of tznius, of modesty that is used by day when everyone could see, should also be used by night when not everyone could see. To which the Gemara says, you're right, the avile letinokos. You make it a children's bathroom. Okay, so I guess it was such a thing like this. Okay, children's bathroom. So children's bathroom again doesn't require that same level of modesty, and therefore is fine. Inami de gadir le behizmi behigmi. Or no, you fence it off. You fence it off. You do, in other words, you enclose it with hizmi higmi, literally means like thorns and thistles. In other words, you don't leave it just simply as an open space, but rather halacha l'maisa, you really go ahead and close it off. Okay, incredible. We'll say. So let's go. So we'll celebrate for today. We'll pick up Emiras Hashem with this Mishnah. Emiras Hashem tomorrow. Yeah, short off tomorrow. We'll be all right. We'll be fine. Let's say shkayach everyone. Wonderful Baruch Hashem to begin the week together. Shkayach everyone. All right, we'll say Chevron on Zoom. Have a great day. Your side today. Thank you. Leaving it's today, tomorrow afternoon. I don't know yet.